Aloha and welcome to this walkthrough of the meteor-example-form application. The idea from this is to show my approach to doing form processing with Meteor 1.4, with Blaze, and with semantic UI. And that particular combination doesn't get covered too much. I haven't seen good examples of it out here, so that's why this exists. Before you start looking at this, if you're kind of new to Meteor or my approach, the first thing you might want to do is look at Meteor Application Template, which is a prior system I built that just shows how I do Meteor 1.4 development, appropriate directory layout, naming conventions, routing, how you get semantic UI in there in general, and the coding standards that I use. So if you haven't looked at that, you might want to look at that first, because I'm not going to cover any of the parts of this application that come from the template. Second thing you need to understand are Blaze templates, and fortunately Blaze seems like it's going to survive after all, since it's been split off. There's an active community, there's really nice documentation, so that's good news. Then you need to read about semantic UI forms and how that all works, and it's fairly straightforward with a couple very non-straightforward moments. You also need to understand about how simple schema does data validation, because that's the validation approach we'll be using, and that's documented here. And then finally, you need to understand a little bit about reactive dictionaries, and there's the Meteor Chef has a really great little snippet here where they talk about reactivity in general and then 3 implementations of it. So that I really like that little article. So that's the one I recommend. Okay, so read through all these 5 links about 30 or 40 times. You should be good to go with respect to this. Pre-installed packages, there's collection 2 and reactive dict. Those are the 2 things beyond the base packages and the Meteor application template that get added. You also need simple schema, but I think that comes along with collection 2. Okay, so what does it look like? It's going to look like this, but I'm going to actually pause so that can actually show you this live. So I've quickly brought it up. This is what it looks like when you're running it, and if you just try submit without providing any data, you can see that it gives you a bunch of error messages. So if we actually include some data, my bio, what I like to do, paddling, and let's pretend I'm a senior. Of course I'm going to have a good GPA, and for majors we'll put computer science, and then if I say submit, then the form actually gets submitted because everything's valid this time, and in fact it provides a link at the bottom to go to the other page where you could actually update. So if I decided that I also like to bike, I can press update, and now if I, for example, refresh this page, you can see that it's still in there. So that's all there is to the system. There's a home page which is available just at localhost 3000, and then there's one other page that you get to in Flow Router by saying student data along with the ID of the document you're interested in editing, and then it will display that document in this form and allow that document to be updated when you press the update button. So that's what all these screens do. Okay, so let's look at the code really quickly. The first thing you probably want to see is the definition of our underlying document that's stored in a collection called student data, and here you can see a text field could be a string with a max of 50, whereas a text area could be in a string that has many more characters, and in fact the bio is not required, so I give it a default value. Hobbies is an array of string. Level is a single string. Hobbies are through check boxes. The level is through a drop-down list. GPA is level is a set of radio buttons. GPA is a drop-down list. Majors is a multiple selection list. And so we create that schema using simple schema. We attach it to the collection. That's how that works. Publications and subscriptions. So you do need to publish and subscribe. I mean, everybody always thinks you got to publish and subscribe. You could use auto-publish, but it turns out when you're doing form processing, you at least with semantic UI, you've got to do publications and subscriptions to make it work out. For the purposes of this example, I stayed very unfancy, just publishing the entire collection, and then we'll subscribe to it in this part of the edit student data. The home page where you create an object, you don't need to subscribe there because you're not actually needing any data from the underlying collection. When you edit data, of course, you have to get at the the data that's stored in the collection and then update it from the ID. So you do have to do it, and then you get this really crazy looking way of initializing semantic UI form input controls. Okay, it's terrible. I'll get back to that in a couple seconds. All right, and then I talk about a little bit about why my hypothesis about why that's actually possible. So let's go through the two pages. Each page has both an HTML and a JavaScript component. The Create Student Data page looks like this. And it's pretty straightforward. It looks just like a semantic UI form, except that we've got a bunch of helpers to add in classes at the top, because with a semantic UI form, basically if the word success, if the success class appears up here in the form class specification, then any messages that are labeled success, such as this one down here, will be displayed. Conversely, if you have the class error displayed at the top in this area of the form, then any classes with the class error will be displayed. Okay, so the problem is with semantic UI is that once you put this error at the top, every single error message is going to be displayed. It doesn't do kind of field by field decisions on this, and so the way that we display only the error messages that are appropriate, that are actually invalid fields, is by wrapping each of these error messages in a helper that checks to see whether that error actually occurred before inserting that code into the HTML. That way, when we say, oh, show me all the errors, the only errors that will exist are the ones that are valid. Okay, so that's the way this thing, there's a form, there are these two things at the top. Basically, this is a three-state form, so either none of these things, neither success nor error, should be included as classes, and that's the case when you're displaying the form at the very beginning, right? And then once you press the button to submit, either there should be the success class in this area or the error class, hopefully not both, and then the appropriate stuff will be displayed. Okay, so that's what, and then other than that, you can kind of see ways that I structured these input fields with a name, ID, value, and so forth to make it easy to get at them and get data out of them. So I would recommend kind of following this with a radio checkbox. You can see that level is the same for all of these, though the value changes, as opposed to checkboxes where you can see the name is actually different. So that's how you get kind of multiple possibilities versus one amongst a set of possibilities. There's another one of these display level field errors. Here's how you make a drop down. Here's how you make and here's how you make a multiple select drop down. You just include this little guy here. At the bottom we have a submit, and then we have our little success message that's there. All right, so no huge big deal there. Let's look at the JavaScript side of this, and we start with the onCreated, and this is where we're going to create a new reactive dictionary so that we can hold flags that indicate whether or not we want to display the success message or the error message or neither. And we also are going to store in it the validation, what's called in simple schema terms a named context that will store validation data. And when you do it this way with this named context, what it means is that the validation flags and so forth are reactive, which is very convenient, so that things, once we actually invoke validation, then all these reactive variables get updated and the page will present itself, re-render itself appropriately to what the validation currently is. We have a bunch of helper functions that do kind of obvious things. to indicate whether we want to put that success class at the top of the form, we're going to go check our message flags reactive variable and see, and if it's truthy, then we'll return the string success, otherwise we'll return nothing. Okay, and similarly for the error messages. Okay, the display success message when it's truthy is actually set to the ID of the created document, and so that's how we use that to actually make the link. We have this onRendered function in the case of the create student data page. It's less funky than in the edit page. This is because we don't have to subscribe to any data for this page, so we can get away with just using onRendered and then run these JavaScript functions. This is a little different from what I found in the semantic UI documentation. They indicate only these are required. When I tried using those, they didn't work. Then I found that I ended up having to actually include these as well. So I just put all 5 of them in just in case, cover all the bases. Then we have this single event handler, which is for the submit form. This gets the event as well as the template instance. We've got to disable default processing, which is kind of standard in Meteor. And then all this code here is basically just getting data out of the form. So you can look at this, and depending upon whether you want a text field or text area checkboxes, you can just look at this code and go, oh, that's how I get the data. When you're creating your own form. At the end of it, I create this object that holds kind of the sum of all of this stuff in a manner convenient for validation. And so the first thing I have to do is clear out any of the old validation messages if I've repeatedly hit the update. I got to clean it because the collection2 class calls this clean function before doing the insert. So in order for my validation to work exactly the same way as it will work when it's invoked again as part of the insert, I want to invoke this clean. Okay. So then I call validation. That creates that sets up all our reactive variables, and then we can just check to see whether the results were valid. If they were, then we actually do the insert, which presumably will succeed because validation was okay, and then set message variables to indicate, okay, yes, success should be true, and it's going to be truthy, I should say, and be set to the ID. Otherwise, and the error message should be set to false. Conversely, if there were errors, then we set the success message to false, and we set display errors to true, and all the reactive variables will be set up such that these things will do the right thing. So that's how the create form works. Edit student data is very similar. There's a lot of duplicated code, and as I say kind of in the documentation, in production purposes you'd want to refactor the common code out, but I felt for kind of understanding how this works, that makes it a little harder, because you now got to be looking at code and thinking, well, what am I in edit mode or create mode? So I just said, forget it. I'm gonna just have the copied code in there so that you can more easily understand what actually happens in these two situations. Okay, so the first thing that you got to do when you're looking at the edit page is you got to make sure that you've got your subscriptions ready. So you got the classic Meteor if template subscriptions ready that wraps around the whole thing. Success class, error class, that's all exactly the same. And then what you'll see in the form is that there's for each of the fields, you're actually going to potentially provide a value, right? Because you're editing it. So you can see for each of these input controllers, there's code in there that figures out whether or not that should be checked, or there should be a value in there and what it should be. So you can kind of look through this when you're designing your own forms and say, well, if I'm going to do radio checkbox, I guess this is how I set it up so that it displays the right thing. And again, we've got the error messages and again more helpers, so on and so forth. So that's basically the HTML side. If we go to the JavaScript side, okay, so we start with, well, that's irritating. If we go to the, okay, if we go to the JavaScript side, which apparently is not going to work yet because I made mistake. I'll fix those links. Go to the JavaScript side. What we can see is the onCreated is the same as before. Oh, this is the create. Wait. Here we go. Okay. If we go to the edit student data JavaScript, we can see that the onCreated is slightly different from before. What's different is this time we have to have this auto run to subscribe to student data. That's what makes that if template subscriptions ready thing work correctly. But then we set up our reactive dictionary and so forth in the context just like we did before. The helpers are, we have a bunch of helpers at the beginning to get the values to insert in the form in the appropriate way. Okay, and that goes all the way, I guess, to here. All of these are associated with that, and basically they start off by using FlowRouter to get the ID parameter out of the URL, which is where we're holding our document ID, so we get our document ID right there, and then we do a find one to get the actual document, and then we just return the appropriate field. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. And then all this stuff down here is just the same as before. These are dealing with error messages and success and so forth. Okay, this is the crazy thing that took me quite a while to get to work correctly. And that is how do you get things like the multiple selection dropdown to work correctly in a situation where you need to know the subscription data and you need the DOM to be rendered. And this, after much failure, I found this, which appears to work. And so you've got this kind of nested callback scenario. It's kind of a drag. But basically the way you think about it is that you need to both have the data from the subscription available to you, and you need the DOM to be rendered. And the reason why you need the DOM to be rendered is because you need to use jQuery. Okay, or you don't need to use jQuery, but Semantic UI needs to use jQuery. So how do you get both of those things to be true? This is the code that appears to do it. Okay. I think the cool thing about this is that if you're using like a charting package or some other third-party library where you also need to invoke jQuery functions in a page that has data, I think you can probably use the same kind of approach to make it work correctly. Let me know if I'm wrong. Then we get the events. We have a submit event just like on the other page, and it's pretty much the same. In fact, it's almost exactly the same except for this one line here, which is instead of doing a create, we're going to do an update. So we need to get the document ID that we're updating, and then we use the set field. And we're just going to, if we were really cool about this, we could figure out which field exactly changed and only change that. That would be like sweet. But I don't try to go there. I just update all the fields. Okay, that's the code. So let's go back to here and see if there's anything else. Miscellaneous issues. I'm using insecure. That means I don't have to use Meteor methods. Of course, you're going to use Meteor methods in production, but moving to Meteor methods is fairly straightforward once you see how to do it with the direct inserts, and it makes this code a little simpler. So I felt for explaining forms that using insecure was made the code as simple as possible. And finally, if you see ways that I can improve this form, this example code for forms, I'd love to have you let me know. Thanks a lot.